is on.
Hello? Hello, how are you? Looks like we have Amaris and Amanda and Brian, Jesse. So, okay, Jesse will be right back. So how did everyone's week go? I saw some reports in the Slack, and Amaris and Sadena, who's not here right now, put together some good materials. We'll probably review those. And then I think Brian has a presentation he wants to give. I think he said he had something for this week. You're muted. Oh. Well, anyways, yeah. So we can do. Yeah, okay. You can do a presentation, and then Samantha's here. Hello, Samantha. Okay. So I hope everyone's doing well in their pursuit. I know everyone's at maybe different stages of research, but as I said before, momentum is the key. If you can keep momentum going on this, it's key. That's the key thing that you want to focus on. So whatever you can do during the week to move that forward, whether it's reading or drawing up like a mind map or a little bibliography or putting together, even a discussion in the Slack, because that gets you thinking. I know Amanda was involved in a nice discussion. We'll go over that today too. So, that's the thing to keep in mind. So don't get discouraged if you have 1 week where you do a lot of stuff and 1 week where you don't do very much, because that's the way it works. Is Jesse back? I don't know if he's back yet or not.
Hey, I'm here.
Okay.
I'll be on camera at the moment, but I'm here.
All right.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Okay, so I don't know if people wanted to do updates, like just say what you've been up to this week to the group, and then we can move on to some of these other things that we were going to talk about. So who wants to go first?
So I was helping Jesse kind of compile some information about Timnit. I can never say anything. Timnit Gebru.
Okay.
So she's a PhD AI ethics scientist who was in recent years kind of came into light. Like, she's always been popular.
Mm-hmm.
A word in the field, but in recent years she became more of a hot topic because her relationship with Google kind of fell apart because there was like controversy over a research paper she did with her superior, something Michelle, I can't remember her first name, but Google kind of tried to distance themselves from her by firing her, but then they try to convince everyone else that she resigned. But it was just like a difference in opinion and what's important in research. So she is on the side of so she's on the side that research should be ethical and shouldn't just be about continuously publishing papers that benefit you and make you look good. They should benefit the public and show the true facts of the situation of research, especially in terms of AI and its future. So I'm kind of just finding out about her viewpoints and what she's doing now.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that you had you put together an infographic. I thought it was nice. I can share it if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
It's not there's still a lot of stuff missing. I just try to put together the tidbits I could right now.
Oh yeah, that's great. We like to have little artifacts, like I've said before. I don't think you're in those meetings, but so this is something that this is an artifact that people can create as they're going along in their work. So this is Timnit Gebru, PhD at AI ethics, algorithmic bias researcher, and then Amaris has these 4 categories: early life. So this is a profile of her early life. founded, and actually it looks like Black and AI was 2017. The DARE Institute is 2021. So the DARE Institute is this new institute that Timnit's founded. It's independent research, and they have they have values that are very different from a corporate lab, and so that's initiatives. And then her view is that algorithmic bias should not only explore the disparities in areas that can arise among different populations, it should be generalized to possible threats, even in perfect AI. And then future goals, and then these are the future goals. And it's under Outlook. So this is a nice, infographic, and now we can build upon this. If I don't know. I know Jesse had talked a little bit about it in the Slack, and I've looked at it a little bit. So there would be a next step there to kind of coming up with maybe a longer artifact, like a longer presentation or a short paper or something like that. What are your thoughts, Jesse?
Hey, sorry, I'm a little bit getting things set up here. No, yeah, that all the stuff is great, and especially I appreciate Amaris pulling all this stuff together, and it'll definitely help what we're doing. I basically, come on, here we go. All right, I support everything Bradly said is just pretty much the case, and I'm just looking forward to kind of continuing to work on that. So, yeah, it's exciting to see things coming together in that sense, and sometimes, like, this is a lot. When you get started and take a deep dive into stuff, this is a great way to do it. So, yeah, it's great.
Yeah, thank you, Amaris. And we, of course, have the Ethics in Tech and Society project. So that's something that fits very well into. So, we need to talk about, like, kind of how to move that. That's the thing. We build these little artifacts, and then we move forward and build up from there. And I think that's a good way to do research, because you see something tangible early, and then you can build on it. So, who wants to go next? How about Amanda?
Yeah, I can go ahead.
Okay.
So I don't know how much we want to talk later about what Jesse put in the Slack, but a separate thing that I've been working through is for a while I've been trying to understand dynamical systems theory, because I feel like I understand its importance, but I haven't like completely gotten a grip on the math. But I started Johan John's YouTube series on it, dynamical systems theory in neuroscience, I think is what it's called. And the first video was great. I feel like I have a much better understanding of it now. I was looking at notes that I took from like another YouTube video I found, and I feel like I've been able to make sense of not just like why it's important, but like the details of how it can be used to explain activity at a bunch of different levels, like the brain level, and then maybe even the more like psychological level. What else? Yeah, that's the main thing.
Good. Well, that's good. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, we have these resources, off, like sort of outside of the lab, but like things that are virtual that people can draw from. And I definitely encourage you to learn more about dynamical systems theory, because that's a nice approach, I think, for understanding a lot of things in the world, not just the brain, but, it's like we think about things in terms of like, hypothesis testing or differences between groups, and that, of course, leaves a lot on the table, especially if you're talking about something going on in real time or in dynamical space. So, a lot of what they call naturalistic approaches to cognition rely on that sort of, that sort of real-time account where you can look at the trajectory of something going on in time. And so that's something that, people have kind of worked on. It's not as common as maybe it should be. But I definitely think, there's a lot of math in the approach, in the different methods that they use, but you don't have to really, master the math right away. You can just kind of figure out intuitively what's going on, and intuitively it's very simple. But that's something that I think there's a lot of value in that approach. So that's good. And we'll talk about the thing with Jesse, the thread, a little bit later on. So we'll be up for that. Thank you for that report. Hello, Erin. How are you? Who wants to go next, Brian or Samantha?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I don't have much to report on. I've just been working on the presentation for today and then the presentation for April 9th, 8th or 9th. But yeah, I'm always excited to be here.
Okay, that's good. And then after we finish up with these reports, we can get to the presentation. So, okay. Samantha, what are how was your progress this week?
My progress this week was more slow than I would have liked. I was working on a different research, paper on artificial intelligence in healthcare, and I was like, this might not relate to what I'm doing. And then the more I was researching it, the more I was realizing the little things, like the types of intelligence that we use as humans actually relates to the research I'm doing for here, and like the little things. So I guess I made more progress this week than I thought I did. And I'm still working on, I know I sent you my outline, and I'm working to put more thoughts together, and then I'd like to share that with you both again, and then maybe talk about it before I start full on writing. But that was not a big progress, but it's progress.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you for that update. We've definitely want to, just even if we make small progress, we want to report it and be proud of it, because it'll lead down the road to, and then, if you find anything, and we did get the outline, so, we'll try to review that at some point soon and, move that along. So, very good. I don't know if Jesse or Erin wanted to do any updating.
I would just say results or outputs are extremely not linear compared to your effort and time spent. So, especially when you're just getting used to all the stuff. It's almost like a certain kind of internal training where you're dealing because we kind of want to see that that nice even direct relationship between time and output, and I would just refer to Bradly and try to focus on momentum, because that's the most. When momentum may not even look the same thing each week. Some week you could be reading a bunch of papers, some week you could be doing a paragraph, some week it's doing nothing and just letting your subconscious mind marinate on stuff. So, yeah, I would just mention that, especially for people who are just starting out. Don't feel like you're supposed to have a 50-page report every week on our desk here. Especially this lab is not that way, because we know that research is doesn't work like that. So yeah. I have a bunch of updates I'll get to. I don't know if Erin is going to be using voice or chat today, but you're welcome to say anything, Erin, that you want to say. Otherwise, I have a whole panorama of things to talk about. So.
Yeah, so I see that there's been a lot of progress on putting together the New York Celebration of Women in Computing talk. I sent you the one I sent you the video.
Yeah, thank you, Bradley, for that. Been talking to Erin about that too. Thank you, Erin, for all the stuff with that you're doing. Angela has pretty much finished her stuff. She sent us the video, which is great. So we're pretty much like we're on track. Things are moving. And I would just ask for anyone who is at the meeting, or anyone who is at the meeting today and is thinking about contributing something, or watching the video and not the lab, just like reach out to me, like confirm with me this weekend. It can be in Slack or DM or whatever. Just give me like a sense of where you're at and what you want to do, just so I can know that, because we are all like, there's not a sense of, oh, you're not gonna make it if you don't tell me, but more like research talks, especially larger research talks, have a very funny way of like, oh, we got 45 minutes, that's a lot of time, and it's like, it actually isn't. Like we pretty much already have half of our stuff, and that could easily be. We're kind of at a point now where it's like we have sufficient, like we can add stuff, and we could like, you know, we're at that like threshold of like there's a lot of things that are going on, and it's just time to make sure we have space for everything that we want to talk about, and we do. Like everything that we've talked about and that post that I reference a lot, there's time there. There's time for like the technical neurosymbolic stuff. There's time for Log4j stuff. There's time for Bradley's stuff and the GSOC stuff. There's time for Angela's data trust stuff. There's time for the Facebook discussion and not Facebook, like Facebook Meta AI big tech discussion. Like those things are all happening, but there were a few people who mentioned interest in certain topics or jumping on certain topics, and more. That's pretty much the update for that. Like that whole New York Celebration of Women Computing. But if I'm open. If anyone wants to meet this weekend about stuff, or in the next few days, and has particular opinions about it, let me know. I'll probably be talking with like Amaris about some of our. She's kind of jumping along with me on the big tech discussion and Timnit Gebru stuff, because I think she's a really interesting case study that people should know about, because her transition into making her own research institute and what she left, what happened, the public sense of it, what Google has done to kind of recover, and how like even at Meta, Facebook's recent discussion, they devoted a whole segment to basically saying, hey, we're really ethical, and we're having here, look at like the applications of our ethics team, and look at hold on here. Yeah, sorry. They were talking a lot about the future. They're talking about like all their unsupervised learning and on-the-coon stuff, and using basically using their augmented reality glasses to complement their personal assistant or other like AI things they're doing, and specific projects. But they really wanted to make sure that, oh, by the way, come work with us, because we're going to be doing good stuff. In ethically, they were basically in one sense it was a total come work with us. We're doing cool stuff at Facebook Meta AI Research, and it basically had it was very much a targeted at people who would be like working with them or potentially trying to get the talent wars in their favor. And the way they talked about ethics was very interesting in that sense, and presented that. So anyway, that's one. I basically see it as like this whole trajectory of, and there's other people. It's not just Timnit Gebru, but I feel like she's such a great thing to focus on during this process of this, like the last year or two. Last year, actually, we talked about her specifically at what happened, and kind of even doing a little bit of a sense of update of what has happened since that time, or a review. That's probably what I'm going to be doing all that stuff, and then Amaris stuff fits really well into that. So that's kind of what's happening on that's kind of the view from what that's going to be, and I think I'm excited. It's going to be interesting because I'm kind of going to be this representative, like an ambassador for the lab with all these different takes on it. But also, like, I think that's really cool. I personally, this is like not only the ethics team, but kind of the relationship that we have with New York Celebration of Women in Computing. Some people were like looking at it recently and telling me like, oh, the conference seems this way, or this is cool and so on. It's a very small, specific conference that's kind of tied to my old university, but I think what they're doing is really great, and I think what we're offering in the context of, I don't know, like a discussion and having the different voices and the different approaches is really great. So, I'm happy things are going where they are. So yeah. Great. So that's that update. I think Simon's here. Did you want to? We were doing like general updates. I have about more things to say, but did you want to, like give a weekly update or like a small update? And then I know we're going to go over like your mind map and other things later. But did you want to give like a quick update if you're here now?
Sure. So this week I met with you and Bradley to just like go over the mind map and kind of like find different connections and like a way to like reroute certain pathways. The meeting definitely did help in terms of just like figuring out like what my next steps are in terms of like literature review and just in general finding like key ideas to highlight. We also mentioned that you guys want me to talk a little bit about what I'm doing in the other lab. So thankfully I actually just had a meeting with them on Friday to go over some of the results for the study that we're doing. Currently right now I'm looking at like adaptive coping strategies and internalizing symptoms and how that relates to empathy. So originally, like we ran a study about a year and a half ago during COVID, and this looked into like individual stress, coping strategies, empathy, and there was like another one, it's like paced breathing. We also looked at their SCL. It was just like different formats of just like studying through multiple covariates and stuff. So long story short, we have the data like sitting with us, and we decided to take a different route with it because our lab is looking more into empathy and just in general like different studies that relate to encompassing empathy's definition. So we originally wanted to look at like different coping strategies or like stress management strategies and emphasizing like religious activities, but we ended up finding like a different route from that. Like after putting it through SPSS, we ended up like looking at coping strategies in general and relating that to like internalizing symptoms, and like after running like a bunch of analysis and looking at how like mediate like meditation, religious activities, and other components like go together, we realized that when it comes to stress management, our analysis like comes out significant when it relates to empathy, but our results were inverse. So it's almost like counterintuitive. Like you would think that like at higher levels of like adaptive coping, like there would be less of a link between things like depression and anxiety and empathy, or like empathy would be like reduced. But like that's not what we ended up finding. In general, like we figured out that when it comes to empathy and things like depression and anxiety, or like internalizing symptoms of it, like as a general whole, we realized that our results kind of like inverse, in which like internalizing symptoms and empathy both went up, and like in general, like they both went up as a result. Like it was, we were trying to explain this like in our lab too, and just figuring out like connections with it. So people who were endorsed in more adaptive coping strategies were more likely to have decreased empathy, but more internalizing symptoms, and then vice versa, which was the exact opposite of our hypothesis, and the opposite of like how we think like depression, anxiety, like ADHD, like things like this influence empathy levels, because like yes, empathy levels were going down, but it didn't really change anything in terms of like how that relates to coping strategies. What it did change was people's reactions to that. And the reactions that we predicted, we wanted to figure out if it was like higher or lower, and we ended up realizing that it actually ended up being lower. So it sounds confusing, and honestly, like we were a little confused too, just kind of like looking at empathy as a whole, and then what we know about it. And usually, like most articles talk about, like a normal, like if one goes up, the other goes up relationship. But with us, it ended up being more inverse. So just looking at that as a whole, we've been trying to figure out other ways of like looking at the data and looking at our results to see why that is, and whether or not like the abstract we have going is still correct.
Yeah. That sounds great.
It's cool to see, like, I feel like with empathy, it's such a dynamic definition of just in general, like an emotional state, but like it's also like very dynamic and like three-dimensional in terms of like what traits and aspects go into it. Because I was talking to Jess and Bradley about this when we were first starting to look at empathy. We were trying to gather just like English definitions of what empathy is and looking at articles that define it. And we've had articles that like talk about empathy and like other definitions of it, and just to like dilute down the most of it, we still ended up having like 50 or so definitions of empathy, all having like different like ways of defining the same thing, if you want to call it.
Right.
But at the same time, like this is just for English-speaking countries and English-speaking researchers. Like it definitely changes when you go to other countries and look at it from different cultures, because how empathy is viewed and like the different traits and states and the properties that go into it fluctuate and change.
Right. Yeah, it's something that you have to keep in mind when you're dealing with a lot of psychological concepts. A lot of neuroscientific concepts are like this, where it's a complex trait, and you're trying to put together all these different measurements to sort of get at the phenomenon. So you say, what is empathy? And you have all these definitions, and sometimes they're verbal descriptions. Sometimes they use measurements, different types of measurements. And of course, depending on the different measurements that you're using, it's a stronger or weaker definition. So it's definitely like, not, we tend to think of like measurements as being exact. And this is a good example where, you really have to work to find the right measurement of it. So it's like what they call a construct, which means you're putting together different things to measure it and to make sure that that is consistent, at least somewhat, so that you can, do another study and it comes out the same way. And, and because of a lot of these issues, and also because if you go to a different culture, it may be different. It's very hard to do that sort of thing where you have replication and you have good, solid measures. So yeah, I think that's an excellent, thing to think about, is this idea of like constructs and how they operate and how you operationalize them, meaning how do you make them work in the world? If I want to measure it, in some context, that's, I just use that measurement and I hope for the best, or, yeah. So Amanda says, lots of philosophical literature about empathy versus compassion and their value. Yeah. And then Erin said, more attuned, cool. So I think when you were referring to meditation, that was Erin's comment. The other thing too, you said it's dynamic. Yeah. And Erin said Sadena, excellent. The other thing that, actually before Sadena joined, Amanda was talking about dynamical systems. And that's another thing to consider, is this sort of dynamical systems representation where, and you can do this with physiological measurements like heart rate or things like that, where you get a trace of output. So it's like you're measuring it and it's fluctuating in time. Sometimes you can do this with behavior, sometimes with behavioral sensors, and you get this fluctuation of response over time, and that allows you to say things about the dynamics of a system or the time dependency of it. So how does this fluctuate over time? And it's, it's a little bit different than measuring like the typical difference between groups, because you're actually looking at the difference over time, and then there's some different ways to measure that. And but this just goes back to this whole point of like, we have to think about constructs and how they're put together and how they're measured and all that. So thank you, Sadena. It was a very good overview of your work.
Yeah, of course. Just like to add on to your point, we're like actually also coding empathy like in the lab for another study, and even just like doing that, there is a lot of like inter-rater like reliability and like variabilities that like go into it, just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of like how we see empathy and like whether our scores like correlate with each other. So I was talking to another professor about this, and he mentioned like I think they use like some sort of program to like code empathy in their lab, but the difference between like him and like I guess like the director that I'm working with, she mentioned that like they also have access to the same program, but she wanted like a human component to it to see if that changes like anything in terms of like how those are scored.
Yeah,
that was cool to see.
There, when I was doing similar stuff in effective computing, there was a lot of part of what we were trying to create was a database that would, for our specific topic, which is kind of like trying to discern human relationships, like a pair of humans talking, could you infer stuff about the relationship between those two people in this particular case, and how things were coded, and I think the database was kind of supposed to be essentially moving towards a tool that could help give some kind of standardization in that area, but there's sort of this, we're getting to this messy area where there isn't clarity necessarily about like how to code things, what's the right way to code things. There's an inherent there, at least for right now, there's a large internal subjective component to that, and everybody is different. There's sort of internal differences, and we mentioned international differences, and it's tough. It's very, I think what I love about research is that when I was getting into this stuff was just how deep in the weeds and how hard it is. You realize things are to prove or reduce uncertainty about in a really effective way, or like in a useful way, and it's hard, and especially I think it was in Sadena's conversation earlier this week where we kind of had a lot of talk about this pipeline about like what's going on internally subjectively, and you have this kind of what we're talking about in like some of Amanda's conversation about like this, there's a space that's internally maybe digital relative to other stuff there, and there's this sort of reality medium or space in between that's like words and physical stuff, and you're trying to go from this internal space to the shared like physical external reality medium, and then there's all these other broader things. There's like culture, there's sort of like temporal dynamics, there's a lot of stuff in an environment that's not contingent upon the agents interfacing with it, and like how do you across these different parts of this pipeline or this sort of web of interfacing, what do you do? And it's cool because that's it's cool. I'm personally like, it's great to be talking about all this stuff because so many conversations that have happened this week on different projects in the lab are spinning around. There's like this nexus of different angles. We're looking at all this stuff, and it's cool to have that. So, we should probably. I guess I'll jump into my updates, and I know Sutton has other stuff to say. I think Brian has a presentation. Let's just make sure everybody who wants to talk today has time to do it. And so I know there's Brian's stuff, and I know Sadena stuff. Who else wanted to present anything today? Did you want to present something specific, Bradley?
No, I mean, we can do our discussion about that thread in Slack.
Oh yeah, that'll happen, and I'm kind of just like, I think I want to get everybody's stuff.
Yeah.
All the other folks who want to talk, let's get this first because those conversations can last.
Right.
Talk for like. So one of my updates is I'm at Effective Altruism global meetup in Boston and it's like I'm a fan of EA stuff and I'll be joining some later today, but the conversations I've been having the last couple of days and last night, I'm tired because I've been reading a lot of stuff and it's been so interesting, especially stuff. There's so much stuff that's coming up related surrounding both some of the Chimera stuff and some of the Jeremy Lin stuff that it's like I'm trying to basically bring as much of that into EA when I talk to those folks and stuff too, which will be later today, and it's going to be interesting when it happens. But it's like I have this event that I'm at and talking to and connecting with here in Boston, but like my heart is a little bit in these conversations. So. That's what it is. We pretty much, for my updates this week, I've had conversations that have been alluded to. The only thing that hasn't really been explicitly stated here, and a little bit whispered about in the chats, is we're talking about Anthony Chimero's work, Tony Chimero's. He's the person who wrote Radical Embodied Cognitive Science, Regular Body Condition. We watched. I happened upon one of his interesting series of events happen. I was looking at his work, and I found a podcast with him and Richard Brown on like Consciousness Live or something. I'll put it here in the Slack because why not? But it's this one. It's this particular link for those who want to see it, and It's like from last year. It's fairly recent, and I know so much of Chimera from like that book, Radical Embodied Cognition, which is a very specific thing he's done. It was really cool to and we'll talk much more about this later, but it was cool because it was going into like it was nice to hear Chimera talk about his positions with somebody who maybe wasn't really on board with them, or like there wasn't a lot of contention, but there was a sense of like, I don't know if I really get or believe these affordances stuff you're talking about. And in a nice way, and there was discussion of that, and Chimera kind of like, well, here's how I feel about this, and here's the hill I will die on about X, Y, Z, but not this, and it was cool in that sense. I led to this extremely just to be like out in the open for myself as a person who's been in the lab a little bit longer than other people here, let's say. I jumped from that into finding a podcast about systems science and cybernetics, in which the host was talking to someone named Jeremy Lin, who's doing work in writing these big narratives about, like this latest one was called Web of Meaning, the Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom. And when I hear stuff like that, I think that's great, and then I get a little bit uneasy because so much of the time I find them to be a little bit grasping and not really rigorous, or just like, do I believe in integrating humanities and science and bringing stuff together? Absolutely, 100%. But I think I get nervous because I find people kind of talk about it often in ways that I feel are not as wholehearted and serious as I'd like them to be. But the podcast was interesting enough for me to look at the book and I looked at the book and I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool so far. So I'm actually surprised on that front, and we'll talk more about this later. But that book led to a lot of super interesting, like reference point in my mind as I'm thinking about, for those of us who were here last week or recently in the lab, Amanda has been looking a lot at like analog digital divide or dichotomies and what's happening in that space. And I mentioned that heavily in our embodied intelligence presentation that I did in kind of the Cognition Futures group about taxonomy and terms and all that stuff, and major dichotomies in like the cognitive science area. And so thinking about Jeremy's book, which is kind of a really interesting look at like Eastern, or at least traditional wisdom that's a little bit more holistic in nature, versus how some of the Western divisive scientific reductionism has taken place, and even how that maybe relates to some of our anatomical developments, and how like at different levels and different scales of time, he's kind of addressing these sort of off points, or like forks in the road points, which is pretty interesting so far. And that feeding back into Shamaro's work and feeding back into our discussion about analog and digital, feeding back into all this stuff, has just been really interesting. And I'll leave it at that as a preview. There's many more points to get into, but it's like that whole web of discussions has been on my mind like so much of this week. And it's funny because, full disclosure, I started out this last week's meeting. I actually there's a Sunday group of like AI safety fundamentals that I'm loosely a part of, and I was talking about, oh yeah, I'm gonna finish reading this ethical regulator paper by like the cybernetics folks and Ashby's son, or who is I don't know Mick Ashby's relationship to.
It's his nephew,
Ross
I think.
Okay, so like, I was like, I'm gonna finish reading this paper, like all about cybernetics and ethical regulation stuff, and I read a chunk of it, but I didn't finish the paper, and I've been focused on this other stuff since then. So just like full disclosure, that happens sometimes, and you're not off the rails if that happens. And so I'm going to continue to go back to that paper, and I will finish it soon. But with that, and also the New York Celebration of Computing stuff, it may take a slight back seat because that other stuff is hot, and then I have another deadline in my life about a big project that I have to go to and talk about. So that's just how it works sometimes. That pretty much is my update. We'll cover more stuff later. Anything that you wanted to say, Bradley, before we give the stage to other presentations?
Not really. I know we had that conversation while we were just talking about how, we think of like numeric things or quantitative things as being very stable and exact, but actually maybe they're not. And I put something in the Slack. I'm going to share my screen again. It's a video from about 10 years ago. I think it's in like open disk chat, I think. No. But it's in one of these channels, and I can't remember where it is right now. But it's this video on ignorance in science. And I think that Jesse made a comment about it where he said he think we should be ignorant. It's Stuart Firestein from New York University, and he did he did a book actually on what he calls the ignorance approach to science. So, we think of science as the accumulation of facts, and we're getting closer to the truth. And then what Stuart's arguing is actually, no, we don't want to. That's not necessarily what happens. What tends to happen is that we operate in the dark a lot of times, and we're trying to find things. That's why we do things like mind maps and literature surveys. Yeah, okay, thank you. We try to find sort of the answer, and sometimes, some areas don't have a consensus. So we just have to try things and see what happens. And so, it depends on where you are in what topic you're talking about. If you're talking about something that's well studied, maybe you have, some good facts to build on. If you don't, then you have to really find your way. But what's interesting is that even things that are well established, sometimes aren't necessarily correct. I mean, you have things that people found in their areas that people have studied, but sometimes there are areas in between those areas that are understudied or not well understood. And so you have to understand those areas, and then when you find out more about a topic, sometimes there's what we call a paradigm shift. If you're familiar with the philosophy of science, they have these sort of ideas of paradigm shifts and integrating evidence and all this stuff. So I'm not going to get into that, but there's been a lot of philosophy of science on this, and so the idea is that instead of thinking of science as maybe getting us towards like a single point, of truth, or that it's always this accumulative process that leads to this single answer. Sometimes we have to fumble around quite a bit to find truths that are persistent, that are replicable, like we said before, and so it's much messier than we like to think, and so that's why he used the term ignorance, because it's maybe it's contentious a bit, but it's also very much the case that we don't know necessarily what we're doing all the time, and it's okay to admit that. So that was the thing I wanted to share. And we had, I think Brian found the video, so anyways, it's in the Slack in one of the channels. I can't remember exactly where it was put, but
it's an open chat forum.
Open chat forum, yeah. Okay, so that's all I had to say on that.
Okay, cool.
So I guess, maybe we should do Sadena's, if she wants to talk about her mind map a little bit, and then we can go to Brian's talk, just because we've been talking about the mind map stuff.
Do you want me to share my screen to just like portray the mind map while I talk about it?
Yeah, why don't you do that? If you can do it. If you can get it to work.
If you can, I think I can.
Yeah.
I think you posted it, so I could share. But it's if you can do it, that's probably ideal.
Just give me 1 second.
Okay. So Sadena made this mind map of, I think it's AI and some other areas, allied areas. And so she's going to show us this map. And this is only one way you can do it. You can do it in a number of different ways, but so she'll show us what that looks like. There we go. Okay. So this is a mind map. All right. Is there a way you think you can rotate it, or I don't know if it's...
All right, let me see if I can zoom in on this just a little bit.
All right. There we go. Yeah, there we go. All right.
Okay. I feel like it's a little hard to read.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, we can zoom into different parts of it if we want.
Okay. As like a general whole, I feel like, so I talked to Jesse and Bradley about this, and I kind of like made a note at the bottom. So the way I started my mind map, I kind of just like took key points from different articles. So I originally started with Childless Hacker and just kind of like worked my way up with a lot of the ideas that I took from this and just like different definitions that they started talking about. And then just kind of like move my way forward to the ultimate learning machine and the next decade in AI. Again, like this is just like a general overview of like different ideas that I took from that. A lot of these smaller branches that you see like coming from like, let's say like for example, in this I talk about unsupervised learning. All of this just comes from different articles that I also look up either through the reference page or like doing a separate literature review after reading about it in that article. At one point, I will get rid of this, but right now it's just an easier way of just figuring out where the origin of what I was looking at came from. A lot of the main ideas that I found, and I talked to you guys about this, was there were a lot of connections that brought me back to machine learning. And in general, it was like I kept falling into this loop of like more technical terms and more things that had to relate to like machine learning and like coding and hacking, which was great because it taught me like smaller ideas that expanded into bigger concepts like robust artificial intelligence or smaller things like just in general common sense, which I had in both sides of the mind map in itself. I feel like I was more or so interested in learning like human intelligence and just like understanding how that works when it comes to like, understanding how to sophisticate AI. I have question marks here because this was kind of like the stop point of a lot of the articles that I was looking at, where it's like the connections that we have right now lead to unsupervised learning, which is just like spontaneous learning that leads to like more robustness in the program. But I feel like there's always like this dynamic aspect of it that a lot of, I don't know, like a lot of researchers and a lot of programs kind of skip through, which is just like common sense or childlike learning, which is like more spontaneous and like just finding ways to mimic human intelligence. And I was talking about this with you guys, but I also brought this point up with my other lab too, where it's like we could have used like a program to code empathy, but there's always like a human intelligence portion of it that brings a lot of other dynamic processes into the circle. And like in this chart as well, I point an arrow with like mimicking human intelligence to this other form of computational intelligence, which is brain emotion learn inspired models. This is just like another class of CI models, and like its aspects or like its properties are to just like solve real world problems, and then it leads me to this other smaller point. Let me zoom in here, which again I also came to a halt because like I learned about Google search algorithms and big data, but when you look at image recognition and speech recognition, you also have to put into perspective like what happens to this data afterwards, and looking at how like the information that's collected is utilized, and just in general what kind of information does image recognition take in. So it's like something I thought about when just like looking at this portion of it was like when it comes to like facial feature recognitions and things like that, they obviously have to recognize certain portions or aspects of your face that like you would see in human intelligence, and then comparing that to like maybe like a system of other faces that have similar proportions but necessarily is not you. So again, it comes down to like the human, like mimicking human intelligence and understanding and differentiating between different faces. But I feel like there's a lot more that goes into it that helps us see how different types of information is utilized. And again, this comes down to artificial neural networks and Bradly's conversation about like metabrains and just having different folds and layers that kind of feed off of each other on some level to mimic human brain behavior. So when you mimic human brain behavior, and I have that here, it's kind of like you solve more abstract situations and complex problems. But again, I came to a halt here because it's like there are different portions of all of this that kind of like stop me from expanding, because it either goes off track or ideas are sometimes too big for me to even put in the mind map because it's like a whole separate idea in itself. But what really helped me kind of like work my way through this and understanding like where I should begin was I started asking myself smaller questions like in the corner here. So one thing that again me and like Jesse talked about and like Bradly brought up like as a definition or just like a different way of like looking at things was like, are you able to compartmentalize like human like the human experience? And even if so, would there be like default settings? Like when I was talking about emotion, because that was kind of like default, like what I wanted to look at in the beginning. There's always like the dynamic process of emotion, and like even looking at theories that came from the ultimate machine learning, it brought me to like an article that talked about brain emotion learning. It's like there's a lot of theories that kind of define emotion, and even when you look at that in humans, it's kind of hard to comprehend how that process fully works because of like different ways of understanding emotion and how you process things like in your own mind. I kind of thought about like would there be like a default setting in which like emotions are more likely to express? So it's like humans have 6 specific like emotions that everybody has in common, whether you're from a different culture or country or race or ethnicity, like whoever you are. It's always like sad, happy, I think, surprised, concerned, and like fearful or like disgust. And it's like you program this in. Yes, like it's probably like an easier route to do so versus like more difficult emotions like empathy and compassion, like love. It's like, yes, you put this in there, but how do you define this when it comes to different spectrums of being sad or like different spectrums of like being happy? And that's kind of why I stopped here, because it's like childlike learning also means understanding like things around you, but also understanding yourself on some level. So when I look at this, it's kind of like, does this make connections to
live streaming has stopped?
Is my thing still sharing with you guys?
Yes, it is. It's fine.
Yeah.
So it's like when you look at this portion of it, like how do you connect that back to like ideas that come from this end? Because I'm also just like, when I look at hybrid artificial intelligence, there's a lot of pros and there's a lot of cons that come into it, but it's like when you look at the cons, how do you go past that? And it's also just like, I feel like the mind maps help me identify how certain things connect with each other. So like the green lines, I mentioned this with Brad and Jesse too. So the green lines are like more like associations that I've made so far from different articles and readings. The pink lines are like more definite, so it's kind of like cause and effect. And then like the white lines that I have going are more like leading connections that bring to other ideas. So again, like it's still a little confusing because like I have like yellow and like white in here as well too. That's just like for me to see like the more expanding ideas. This is all gonna like I'm gonna change this eventually to all be one color so it's more understandable. But again, in general, like the mind maps help me understand like other directions that's being taken with artificial intelligence outside of just machine learning. And then there's also concepts like deep learning and predictive analysis and just like finding more robust programs to shift us over to like the more cognitive aspect of like AI programming. But in general, I feel like there's also a lot of dead ends that you are able to see when you do this. And it's helped me see that too. And it's just kind of like where you work your way from there or asking yourself the right questions to get to the next step.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we talked about this as well, that sometimes if you look at this map, you see like these gaps, and like some of it, is obviously, always more can always be added in, but sometimes you kind of converge upon gaps that are, like where there's nothing that's been done. So, like where you have these question marks around childlike learning, sophisticated learning, that's sort of like a stopping point right now in the field. Like people don't necessarily know how to do that, or it's not something that's mainstream. So, there may not be work on that at all. And so that's an opportunity right there to do some work. And this exercise actually helps you do that. It helps you to not only synthesize what's going on in the field. And you can see there's a lot of stuff going on. So it's hard to it is by necessity nonlinear. You have some pathway that you can follow, and it comes back around, and but also you have these spots where you can clearly see that there are gaps in the field or in the literature, and it's easy to see with the mind map because if you just write out a literature review, you can it's harder to kind of visualize where that is and what's around that space. So around childlike learning, there might be some other issues that are related. And then you can say, oh, childlike learning and maybe hybrid intelligence, there might be a connection there. Or brain emotion learning and childlike intelligence, there might be some connection there. And then you can draw lines and think about your own thing that you would contribute and say that's where it fits in. And it helps you with the literature search too, or literature review, because then you can say, what do I need to put in the literature review? I can put in some, maybe some things on childlike learning or other things going on. So it's really, I think this is really a really nice start. And, this is something you'll revise, again and again and again, as you mentioned, the sort of defining the lines, the color of the lines and the color of the boxes is important. So, in the sort of in the development of this, we want to have connections made, but different types of connections. So I like the fact that you have causal connections, but also sort of more suggestive associations. Causal is kind of a loaded word, but definitely there are connections that are sort of in the literature, baked into the literature, and then there are connections that you can see that maybe people haven't really followed up on, but they're obviously connected. So
Right.
having a legend like that, and definitely that's a value to have those different types of lines, and just so that people know kind of how things fit together in the field. And so this is a great start. I like this.
Yeah, um, I agree with that, and I also really appreciate. There's a very particular thing, and I'm really speaking to people who are newer to doing research, and I really appreciate what you're seeing here is like you know this is something that Simon's been putting together in a very organic way, and this is a very internally one one person's different topics, and if in academia science we almost never show that in a serious way, and um, you know I'll phrase it this way, and this is I'm talking in a general approach here, and I know Sun has done a bunch of other things in different labs. It's not like this is not the first time talking about these things at all, so absolutely not the case. But I really want to emphasize for people who are starting out, there's a really special and delicate process. This as it stands right now, maybe you're not going to go publish this map as it is, but this map is so important, and I really like being able to talk about this between researchers because you get to see how when you're coming into an arena, especially this big interdisciplinary mess that we're all talking about, you're coming in and it's you kind of are just you have a perspective and you know things, and there's a lot of stuff you don't know, and you're diving through it, and it's you have this limited vantage point, and you're expanding that vantage point in a particular way, and like in a this is reminding me of some talks about like analog digital stuff, and like how there's even in our representations there may be some embodiment like constraints that affect it, and they kind of this is a tangent for another conversation with Shamira stuff, but like as you're entering from this perspective, you're starting out and then you're moving forward as sort of like your mapping, or like where you are, almost like think of Google Maps, and little pinprick in the map when you're walking around that person on the map. You're moving forward in this map space, and what you see, it's like how resolution changes. Like when you get closer, like oh now it gets better resolution, or like you're in like a MMOR, a big online game like RPG. Like you move closer, and then the background becomes more clear. You're going through this process, and it's really special, and people don't talk about it enough. So I just want to say, like, this is such an awesome, thank you for like sharing this, because I always feel like there's such a weight against people sharing their personal like journeys, and that's kind of part of why I'm trying to do frontier map stuff. Like if I get to my frontier map like area, there's a if I move forward with frontier map enough, it's gonna like encourage a lot of what's happening here, and I like Sada's doing it in a great way. And so outside of that kind of like broader concept, we lost Erin. Sorry, I look at what was in the chat here. I will get to Erin's comment in a moment. But yeah, like just to finish up commentary on Sada stuff, part of the joy and difficulty of a lot of this stuff is like, especially around AI. I'm gonna really target out artificial intelligence, and to an extent cognitive science and psychology, which are a little bit cognitive. I'll be tough love about AI and also cognitive science, because I talk about them all the time. You know, I'll still draw my Nunez paper. What happened to cognitive science? Like, where are you guys? Just everybody in the entire planet for the last 50 years. What do we actually got? Where's your cognitive science? You know, but they don't make the same kind of claims that AI does. So AI gets even more tough love, let's say, and it's like we hear all this stuff about, oh yeah, we're like 10 years. The joke in the field is like we're 20 years away from human-like AI, and that has been the case for the last 80 plus years. It's always been 20 years away, and it's like, okay. Like, so what's the hype and what's the reality? And that's where a lot of like Gary Marcus and the critics come in, and all these different AI winners and stuff happens. Yeah, but like as a researcher, and you're coming into stuff, you hear these things, or you have these suppositions like, oh, like we're kind of at the point of we're almost ready to solve unsupervised learning, right? And it's like, maybe not. And you get to these sort of endpoints, or like here's you know, it's like going back to like the video game analogy, like you've reached the end of the map, like your character cannot proceed forward anymore. Like you've hit a wall, and it's like, okay, like can you make progress on that wall? Why is that the limit for it right now? Is it methodological? Can they not get away to test it? Is there a limitation in the theory? Is there not enough people doing it? Is there funding reasons why not? All these other things that are happening, you know? And it's like when you're going through it and you're looking at interdisciplinary stuff, that's the hard work of it. And you don't know that until you get a lot of context and read and talk to people. This is where talking to people really helps. People who have been in that field for a while, because will they know everything you want to look at? Probably not. Especially in this area that's super interdisciplinary, probably not. Like I would say, unless you find someone who specializes specifically in what you want, probably not. They're not going to know everything. But you kind of get in this role now of the researcher and the knowledge generator. Hey, I talked to Bradly to get his perspective on this stuff, because he knows a little bit about this area, or a lot about this area and that area, and I'm going to combine that with my other PI about their expertise, and you're going to try to, in your mind, merge the stuff together. And like that's just, you know, I'm waxing semi-poetically about this, but like that's there's so much magic in that. I feel like that is, if I want to do anything, like I want to be a hype man for that process, because that is like, that's what it's about. And I feel like we don't really, especially, it's a little bit different in like some of the harder sciences, but not really. And I feel like that process is so special to talk about. And to go all the way back, yes, like I think Sadena's really doing well to get to those points of what are those things and how do they do it. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. I know there's a discussion happening in the chat.
Yeah. So Erin said, yeah, I've been thinking about this for years, and someone brought up they're progressing in their dynamical systems math journey. That was Amanda this morning. As someone who enjoys math and enjoys people using math as communication tool, an internal thinking tool, so both of those, I am moved by finding a lot of the reason many people turn away from using or exploring math is they're encountering strikingly bad and inaccurate definitions. So this means, like, there's math communication and teaching math what it is, and especially some of the higher order concepts. The first line of the Wikipedia definition, for instance, for dynamical systems math should be, in mathematics, a dynamical system is a system for which a function describes the time dependence of the occupation of a point in an ambient space. Radically misinterpretive. No wonder people find math challenging when mathematics specialists often poorly express concepts and have not grown in their own grammar abilities, and then poorly execute attempts to explain maths in spoken written non-math language, obscuring math's ideas in their readers conceptualize, but don't end up understanding because the speaker's word is objectively poor. So basically, using linguistic terms to describe this phenomenon in math, and then if people use like a visualization, it helps. But then, what is the visualization doing? So there are kind of layers of communication issues here. And this isn't to say that maths teachers should feel badly. It isn't to say we should never speak of what we can't speak perfectly. It's to point out that we can approach these subjects with some imprecision, and some of the most venerated maths experts. Many people presume they can't math, or that maths are more complicated than they actually are, when the reader is just taking the writer-speaker literally, and the bequeather didn't use their language tools aptly in that instance. We can all keep on climbing. So very good at Erin. Thank you for that. I think that's a great observation, and I know a lot of people, this is a big stumbling block for a lot of math education, and math in general is like getting that understanding what's going on. So when you say something like this definition that you pull up from Wikipedia, technically that's correct, but like, what does it mean? And so, you have to know like kind of some terminology there, first of all. Then you have to have like an example. So no example is given. It's just kind of like, here's a pure definition of what it is. And then you draw it out. People kind of understand it, but they can't connect to some domain that they're interested in. So, I mean, I think this is a great thing to bring up, because, people have tried to do this and with varying success. And I think, especially when you're applying it to like, brain, cognitive science, psychology, even biology, in those areas where it's not like a native, like in physics, it's kind of taught alongside of, dynamical systems as part of the curriculum. And then, physical systems are kind of easy to understand in terms of their quote unquote dynamics, because you have these examples that are basically physical. If they use an example, they'll use like a pendulum, for example, it swings. Well, that's a physical system. But then what's the psychological analog of a pendulum? And then there are some psychophysical things that you can bring up, but largely that's not helpful to people who want to study something like empathy or, so it's there is this gap between like practical examples. How do you root it in a real example? instead of just saying that this is a thing that happens, and then I tell you about a pendulum, and then you're like, well, how do I use it for X? And it just doesn't become clear. Yeah, so Erin says then the maths experts aren't always even accurately defining the math because their English grammar is so poor. Yeah, and that's, there is this issue of like using language to describe this stuff and then jargon and all this. Yeah, so that's good. Brian said, love this as an arts person who's become a math person especially. And then, yeah. So, and then Brian made, I think, a comment which may be separate from this. Human level AI might require 1.7 Einsteins, 2 Maxwells, 5 Faradays, and 0.3 Manhattan projects. That was a John McCarthy quote. So that was in reference to the mind maps. And then Erin says, it isn't just a matter of lay people not having the education to understand the maths. Yeah, so that's the point that she made earlier about the descriptions and how to sort of present it. So, did we have any comments on that?
Not completely related, but this actually made me think of in my information literacy course, or I took at sort of the beginning-ish of the semester, like it ended already, but so we're talking about open source and how it should be like more readily available. So I was thinking while I was like studying for like that portion of the course was originally like the research that we use, or like the sites like the school offers for accessing a lot of the articles that we use for research or just courses, originally was created for the intention of like for the general public and other professionals to use and to like get a grasp of where the research is right now. But I think we've gotten used to the fact that most of the people that read those articles are also professionals, so we kind of tend to use professional jargon that no one else really understands. So not only is it hard for like someone like my sister who's not like a science major at all, or like really like if she was interested or like heard something on the news and wanted to research it, she would have to first get access to the article, and then she wouldn't really understand it because there's all a bunch of professional jargon that she doesn't understand. So it's like we kind of get used to using big words when we could have just like dumbed it down a little and made it so that a regular person who might have conflicting views sees another side, learns about it, and then can build up their, I guess, reading level or like, whatever, to read professional jargon to an extent where they can understand even like the basics.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's definitely an issue, and like, and this goes for any science really. We write things in verbal descriptions, and a lot of times we write with jargon, or we're not precise in the way we state things, and that's one big thing about like these constructs, is that when you're making a construct, it's like what goes into a measurement, and then you have to like kind of define it. And you have to use very precise terms, because if you don't, then it becomes the conversation becomes imprecise very quickly, and it's like, what do you mean by this term? What do you mean by that term? So that whole process is very, it's. But then again, you're dealing with a lot of technical issues, so it's a big challenge. It's really hard. And I think Erin mentioned that if you're not like an expert communicator, you can it can make it all worse, because it's like you have to really be very precise, and it's a huge challenge, and I people are struggling with a lot of things in the literature, and you will if you go into like a paper that's super dense. Don't worry. I mean, it's something a lot of people struggle with. It's not just something that even people who are in a field sometimes will really not understand it. Like I've been in seminars where, we'll discuss a paper and maybe we don't even know what they're talking about in the paper. Like the author has meant something else, and we're kind of going off on a tangent because we didn't really get what the intent was. I've seen that before, and it's just because that's the nature of this this enterprise. So that was good, Erin. Thank you for bringing that up.
This actually reminds me of. I'm gonna see if I can find this really quickly. I think it's important to have. I think it's important to have the conversation we just had that Erin brought up, because that's something that's it's something. I can't find this thing now. It's something that we don't. It's a very difficult process because there's a. Where is this? I'm trying to find this. Someone. There's this Twitter thread that someone started like as a joke. It was something like, why did you get into science or like academia, and like the wrong answers only kind of a thread, and I'm trying to find my response in it so I can show it, but maybe I can't find it. Basically, my response was like, I don't know. It just seemed like this is a field where everybody has it all figured out and knows what they're doing, and like my response is this sort of sarcastic take on like people kind of knowing what's going on, and like So I know I'll make it under. No, we can move on to.
Okay.
I know Brian's gonna.
Yeah.
But,
so let's move on to Brian's talk. Yeah. I know he wanted to present.
Sure. How long should these things usually be? Like 5 minutes? Because I know we got a lot to do.
Yeah, 5 minutes, and then we can have discussion around it. So.
All right. So this will be just really quick, hopefully. What?
If you go over 5 minutes a little bit, that's fine. Like you're not. There's not like a huge amount of stuff we could do later, but like for this like shorter flash talk, that's a great aim.
Okay, great. Okay, let the flashing begin. Let me just get the slides up. Can you see that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, okay, there we go.
Yeah, is that good?
Yeah.
So, I read this book. I actually listened to it in my car for the most part. So this will be an interesting flash talk because I've read it since I listened to it, but mostly I got everything that I'm going to be talking about from listening to it in a car. So that was an interesting way to get into this book. George Zarkadakis' In Our Own Image. I should mention a little bit about George. He talks about his history in the book, but basically he was somebody who got his PhD in control systems and was one of the early people to make an expert system. His was designed to work in hospitals. And he does a good job of explaining how he doesn't think that's actual useful AI, but he has a really good perspective on cybernetics and lots of things like that. So quick reactions to this book. The bad news first is that this book is extremely Eurocentric, pretty conservative, very scattered, contradictory, and not scientifically or philosophically rigorous at all, despite the authors having a background in science and philosophy. So it's, I wouldn't say I would recommend people read it, but there are some interesting things about it. The good news, the things that I liked, was that it had it firmly in its own perspective. He acknowledges that he's Eurocentric. He acknowledges that he has this kind of conservative viewpoint. And so that's good. So that makes it a lot more fun to read. He has this great hypothesis that he doesn't really do anything with, which is that culture creates and informs science. And he kind of says this directly in a few interesting ways, which we'll talk about later, but then he just kind of lets it sit there. It's also got some fantastic examples of ancient ideas about AI, which is really cool. And then, of course, cybernetics and its relationship to metaphor and narrative I found really interesting. So first, culture creates science, creates culture, this kind of feedback loop. I won't read this whole thing, but I'll just summarize it. Basically, the thing that got me excited about this book was that I had just been at this Sonoran Desert Museum that he mentions. Kind of see a picture of it there. when I read this book. So I'd just been there, and then all of a sudden in this book, he's talking about sitting at this table that I imagine I was just at. I feel like I know exactly where he was. And he discovers that him and the other group of scientists that are all there to discuss consciousness, a conference organized by Hammeroff and Chalmers, it turns out that they all love science fiction, which is awesome. And so he says this really interesting thing. Let's see, where is it? And then it struck me. Fictional stories, such as the tale of Commander Data, Star Trek, had played a pivotal role in influencing everyone's academic life. So it kind of starts to suggest this really interesting hypothesis of the narratives about AI causing research in AI. So it's very simple, but I liked it. And I found some more. I tried to look for more evidence of this view in his book. I could really only find these 2 quotes, which is, could there be a link between literary narratives and scientific research agendas? And then he also says at one point, we seek to create intelligent machines because we are driven by stories about spirits incarnating into our creations. So part of this book is that he goes in a very Campbellian way on a jaunt through the history of spirituality and of consciousness, and kind of tries to prove his point, but doesn't really go far enough. I'll go really quickly through some of his interesting AI examples. The first one, I just like this story about Samuel Johnson kicking a large boulder to prove that the physical world exists. It's cute. Yeah. The brazen head. This thing, I don't know why, I got really excited about it. This idea in this play from the 17th century in which they create Friar Bacon and Friar Bangay create a brazen head which tells the truth. They have to raise a devil to do it. And of course, while they're asleep, their servant teases the head until it comes alive, says 3 things, and then explodes. Just love that. And I didn't realize also that later, Walter McCullough actually references this book when he's talking about what he wants to do with AI. So it's further evidence of culture informing science and whatnot, and that beautiful feedback loop. Then he has some really good recent examples of AI research and problems and interesting parts about them that he uses to make his point. One of them was the Human Brain Project, which I don't know if I didn't know about this until I read about it in this book. And I looked it up recently. This first part of this slide is from the Wikipedia. It seems like most people have no idea what came out of it. The people I contacted struggled to name a major contribution that the Human Brain Project has made in the past decade. And writing in 2015, Zarkadakis pretty much says, yeah, I used to feel this way, like that if you take a brain apart and put it back together, you probably should be getting consciousness, but now I don't really feel that way. And he goes over Penrose and Hammeroff's orchestrated objective reduction theory, which is that consciousness is quantum, which is amazing. I don't know if Zarkadakis has much to say about it. I just kind of like his summation of this idea. Memristors and neuristors. As a hardware engineer person, I think this is awesome. I'm super excited to see what comes out of this. I won't go too deep into them. The idea of Nuva AI, just picture Bradly books. This reminded me of DevoWorm. Just a shout out really quick.
Yeah.
Got excited about that. So he makes some conclusions about the singularity not being a thing because it's not. And then there's some things about the history of science. In particular, the form-matter dichotomy, like the Cartesian dualism, at the core of Western thought since the Renaissance, being directly connected to terms in computer science, I thought was pretty interesting and a pretty good point. And then I just included this timeline that he made of AI, beginning from 65,000 years ago and going on. So you can kind of see his whole thing. I won't go through it, but it's pretty comprehensive and interesting. That's it. It's my talk.
Yeah.
I did it. Oh, yeah. And also, he quotes a lot of men, and the only woman that he quotes, Pamela McCorkle, he, for some reason, attacks her and says that she's wrong for no reason. I can't figure it out. He's weird. Anyway.
Actually, if you could go... Oh, yeah, thank you. It was great. Could you go back to one of the slides, actually?
Absolutely. Which one?
You gotta share your screen and then start going back. It was just before you started getting into those references or whatever. So it's
Sure.
probably it was well after that.
Really?
No, farther forward.
Was it the timeline
I
stuff?
think after the Nouvelle AI slide.
This thing?
No, next I think.
This
Yeah,
thing?
this one. So this is yeah. So this is what was this? Could you tell us more about this?
Absolutely. So this was an interesting part where he was kind of going off after explaining the history of Western philosophy, basically,
Yeah.
and its connection to AI. He brought up this guy Stefan Helmreich, whose picture is there, and how Helmreich spent some time at the Santa Fe Institute, kind of doing philosophy of science, history of science research there, into figuring out how scientists thought about the artificial life that they were creating. And this is connected to actually what we were just talking about. He found out that they believed that the world was mathematical. So it followed with this human brain project idea that if you took a brain apart, consciousness would just be in there, that it's in the math, that the world, it can be explained by a few mathematical rules. And he does a good job, I thought, of connecting that idea to the Renaissance. Yeah. So Jesse says Santa Fe Institute is basically a complexity science think tank.
That's an interesting point. I just wanted to because you kind of went over it really fast, but so yeah, that's good. So did we have any other questions about any of the slides or content? I know we had some things in the chat. So that's what Jesse said about the Santa Fe Institute. And then Erin made some comments. That was, I think, from before. So, yeah, I think that's all we have in the comments. That's a timeline of AI, very long. But, this is, yeah. And then after that timeline. Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
Sure. No, I think this is great, and I think this is also like, I appreciate Brian's let's say critical questioning of like motives and culture and biases that are at play, and this is important to have, but also like very honestly, kind of the norm that is important for us to realize. Like, so much of the discussion about all this stuff has been framed from awkward context, and I would just very much applaud basically pointing that out in a very frank way as it has been done. The content's interesting. I do like how the timeline starts. I think it's starting kind of. I like how it starts at that time and kind of goes up through there. I feel like I would almost wonder like what Joanna Bryson would say, because her whole thing is like, oh, we are the AI, as in like is like human, like is artificial and general intelligence going to happen? It's like, yeah, we are that, and how we are cyborgs, and like this is the development process here. And there's a lot of interesting things to a lot of things keep circling around, and I might dive into this more in the next talk if we go there.
Jesse, what's her name that thinks that we are the AI?
Joanna Bryson.
Yeah.
Joanna Bryson.
I'll put it next time. Yeah, she was at the Embodied Intelligence conference. I actually had I had the amazing fortune of meeting her in person, and I didn't know who she was. It was a wonderful experience of like, hey, you just talked about some cool stuff, and your name's on this pamphlet. I'm sitting at your dinner table for this event. Great. So she's a cool person. She's very interested in like politics and ethics and the narratives, and I don't agree with her about everything, but I think I agree with her about a lot of things. And I like her take on stuff. But yeah, no, this is a great presentation. This is I would even say like this is kind of a nice flash talk, because this is the kind of flash talk where like there's way like we could spend an entire meeting over everything in here, and
Yeah.
that's cool when you have a flash talk that's like so compact kernel, and like we maybe even refer to this like next week or something like that. So like don't think that just because we only had 15 minutes on it this week, like it's not all lost. We might just, hey, remember last week, blah blah blah. We can bring it up again, and definitely share that in the chat, please, because I think a lot of us will be curious about it. And yeah, like that's great, and thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
My pleasure. I'm always happy to present. I love talking.
Yeah. Erin said Bryson sounds like Teilhard du Chardin, who was almost like maybe a mystic or like someone who argued that they sort of combined evolution and sort of this teleological viewpoint, so that we were evolving towards a certain point in. I think that's an interesting comment.
Yeah, I'm interested to read Bryson and find out where she's different from Kurzweil. That's exciting. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, I would say like Kurzweil is pretty much like the singularity is happening, right? Is that like how do you see Kurzweil like in general?
And I thought actually that in this book that I was just reviewing, they do a good job of just kind of saying like, look, this is. Let me just bring it up again. It's like, look, it's feasible to have human level AI, but just assuming that Moore's law is going to continue and that'll cause a singularity is ridiculous. Like that's so. I really appreciated that because I always thought Kurzweil. I respect the guy, but it's like, come on, really?
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel also. And what I like about Bryson is like Bryson's super real. Like, look, computation has a physical component and it has limits too. Like there's hard limits. There's like I don't mean to say we are the AIs and like too super mystical, but more like I think she's particularly sensitive to like she was a keynote speaker at the embodiment conference, so she's like big on embodiment. She's big on kind of like grounding it in some real stuff. So there's a whole lot to be said about that. I don't know, Bradley, what you would like to discuss next, because there's a bunch of things still on the table.
Oh yeah, so yeah, we'll move on to this Slack discussion next. I see Erin just put something in on Teilhard du Chardin. That this person viewed the universe as an evolutionary process which was constantly moving towards a state of greater complexity and higher levels of consciousness. So you have, and so I want to get to this Slack conversation here that was Jesse and Amanda, and I think I was in there a little bit, and I can't remember. I think it was in Cognition Futures, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was the main thing. There's the main. Like if you scroll up a bit, there's one. Oh, no, that's it right there.
This one here,
and
yeah.
There's another discussion.
Actually, I think I can pop it up in the sidebar and then open it up a little bit here. So this is the sidebar conversation. So this is Jesse's. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
If maybe you can read it.
Yeah. So Jesse's watching this video here. This is the Consciousness Live video, and you can see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Because I've done enough of this where people can't see my screen. And so this is the thing he's referring to. So he had this trippy, interesting set of thoughts around 1 hour into this, 59 minutes, something like that. There's a discussion with Tony, which I think this is Tony here, or this is Tony.
On the right. Tony's on the right.
On the right. Okay.
Yeah, I can like cover this, maybe be more concise than my writing there. Basically, this is the video I mentioned earlier. It's Tony Sumero on the right, and then this guy named Richard Brown. And I don't know Richard Brown's background, but I would just catch him very quickly as saying, he talks about consciousness. He has a podcast called Consciousness Live. I don't really know his background fully, but it was cool because he kind of was like he wasn't initially totally on board by stuff, and it's cool to hear Shamira talk about that. And suffice to say, I'll try to summarize what I was saying there quickly, and then kind of turn it over to Amanda because I know she has a lot of things to say about this. Or basically, this, in my mind, some stuff was going off between the conversation there and a lot of our discussions about digital analog, and I'm a little bit tainted more by my recent conversation with Amanda, but it led to a lot of discussions about like what sort of are what are constraints in an embodied sense. And he made one of the most interesting points, and if Amanda wants to elaborate on this more, maybe was about like a major question is like where does embodiment or non-representational or anti-representational, but like things that do not require representation in an embodied sense of intelligence, where does that end, and where is the heavy representational stuff, or I believe the term was representation hungry stuff, like where do those things end? And one of my insights, personal more so myself insight, is like I realize intellectually it's easy for me to understand these things in dichotomies, and even like there's limitations to dichotomies, but I'm kind of re-examining in my mind how I'm configuring all this stuff and realizing that even though we talk about it in a dichotomy like way sometimes, I'm really focused on the fact that there's probably like just many gradients of overlapping and mesh points between them. And that's one thing. And then I would say one of the interesting points that was mentioned was Shimero, and I don't think he elaborated on this, and I'll kind of bring Amanda in here, but like he basically said something like he believes that non-representational embodiment stuff acts as a constraint on our representational abilities. And I kind of asked Amanda to say more about that if you want.
Yeah, so that is like one of the main questions that I like left our conversation with, which is how do you get from this stuff that can happen non-representationally to stuff that clearly seems like symbolic representation manipulation. So I did find that part of the video again where he talks about how the explanation of the representation hungry stuff will be, he says, strongly constrained by the lower level / ground level stuff like motor control. So the lower level being the activity that affordances seem to be able to explain really easily, like how we literally move through the world. He thinks that will constrain stuff that looks very different from that, like planning a birthday party is his example of something that seems like you need representations. There are all kinds of sophisticated activities that we can think of where you need symbolic representation. And he thinks that you have to tell a story about how you get from A to B, about how you get from, the affordances embodiment to stuff that looks more computational and disembodied. So one question that I left the conversation with that I haven't returned to is what can that story look like? He mentions a book called Linguistic Bodies. I didn't write down the author, but the gist is that language is super important, and that the story from embodiment to symbolic representation will probably be social. It'll probably have to do with just our social nature and the importance of language in our development.
Yeah,
I think that's all I have to add.
Sure, and feel free to interject with any we have so many. I met with Amanda yesterday to kind of have a pre-discussion about this because there was so much other stuff, and it may just evolve. We may basically just be having a Cognition Futures reading group again because that's what we had before. It may just evolve into that. So anybody's welcome to join that, by the way. But we had this discussion, and as you can you can kind of see in the in those earlier. I'm gonna pull up. I can see it better on my opening Slack myself. But like in those pinned comments in Slack, I'm mentioning things like the analog digital divide and how like there's sort of this embodiment. There's something about maybe internal states being digital, and then there's analog components, and like analog components sort of have to do with this navigational aspect in the real world, and like there's a sort of medium. The medium of interfacing has some kind of analog component, and there's this. What is the relationship between sort of the digital, not that which cannot be seen in the moment or interface with in an analog, physical, embodied sense, and just what is the relationship between that stuff, and what else did I say here? There's this whole other. There's a whole branch of the discussion that goes into. I mentioned Adam Safron here, and then later on in the other comments below, I mentioned. I think in the next. I think in the. There's another comment that says basically like entering discussion with Amanda. It's just a separate thread in the Discord, and in that one I mentioned like Zador and his genomic bottleneck. Yeah, the one on the left, like right
here.
That one.
Yeah,
so those are super duper. Like I'm laughing because it's like I wrote like 2.5 bullet points from like that massive big conversation, but it's like all I could write down in the moment. I was like, all right, so I mentioned I think I called Zador, but I mentioned Tony Zador's genomic bottleneck. I mentioned Adam Safron's work in sort of physical embodiments shaping perception, and shaping our inputs, and so on and so forth. And there's a whole. If Amanda wants to talk about like the Shimero versus Johann stuff, that's a thing too, or like the hierarchy of needs stuff that we talked about. Those are all on the table. And also my favorite story in the lab, my personal favorite like reference is the legendary epic story about my friend's cat who was not used to being basically an outdoor cat, a cat that was not entirely feral but totally not acclimated to human life. And then the transition, like I love that story because like seeing all these different changes as the cat became more like domestic, and so on and so forth. And there was this beautiful, I use that analogy, or like stories are important for discussing, this stuff. But like, I'll mention that story quickly because I think it's kind of accessible, and then I'll turn it over to Amanda again to like talk about those other things. But the cat, what I was thinking about in the cat analogy, which is again me observing my friend's cat over a period of several months as the cat, when it first came in, is very raw, and like I explained it this way: is like when it was interpreting embodiment or non-representational stuff, as in like when you're living in the wild, all of the signals that would be non-representationally heavy, like a noise, light, a sound, someone you don't know, those have an extremely high weight of like importance. Like you have to be focused on a non-representational view to survive. The natural signals have to be prioritized, and it's not that the cat can't do it, because I'll finish this one first, but like how as the cat becomes more acclimated to being humans, there's these representational concerns that take a much higher weight. Like the cat may recognize who you are. The cat knows that it's safe in the house and not having to like act like it doesn't know what's going on, or like there's a social deference, a representation that it's much more than just the total immediate. I don't know. I would call it like raw and unrefined input. And I'm not explaining this very well here, but I'm trying to compare like a signal of a embodied, non-representational nature, and kind of like having to use that mind and that set of intelligence in a particular way, versus a different representational heavy way that is maybe less directly attuned to those non-representational formats. And there was an adjacent story I was that I still don't really talk about very well, but it basically was this. It was something, and I'll just say this super quickly because I can't talk about it right now very well. But like a story about looking at development and developmental capacities and language and like social referencing in smaller children and also like apes basically, and how there was it felt like there was, suffice to say, it felt like there was a difference in the weighting of embodiment versus representation, in that there may have been even more balance in the apes, because once they understood a certain puzzle, they just were like, oh, I don't have to deal with any of the representational stuff. It basically was like a trick puzzle to get a treat, and they're realizing that if you actually just took this shortcut as opposed to doing this like social referencing or other tasks, you could just get the treat and like, oh, I don't care about this stuff. Whereas the children, even once they understood the shortcut, they were putting so much emphasis on other dynamics that weren't at play in the situation that they acted in very different ways. And it was just like, more about that study some other time, because that's another deep in the weeds thing. But yeah, so of those bullet points or anything else that you wanted to talk about, Amanda, I kind of offer you the stage to comment on anything.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about Johan and one of his blog posts that was titled something like, "Yes, symbolic representation occurs in the brain." And I read that and I was like, this seems right. And I'm familiar with Shamaro's view, and I think he's right about a lot of things. So I'm thinking, like, how can they both be right? So that's one question I want to answer for myself. But one thing from the blog post that I thought was particularly interesting was he has this analogy for like what symbolic representations are. He argues that they are like discrete. That's like part of their function. There's like no ambiguity between symbols, or else they just couldn't play the role that they do. And he says that maybe we should think about symbols as just like the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot going on underneath, and one thing that's going on underneath the water is that they're like connected. Like there's mechanisms underneath that connect all of our symbols. Then he uses the analogy of like lily pads, where you have, it's like one organism, but you only see the discrete bits. So I want to keep thinking about that metaphor when it comes to answering the question of how we move from non-representational stuff to what looks like, at least, like discrete symbols in our cognition. Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I was going to reference your cognitive hierarchy of needs comment, because I was. This came about when I was originally thinking about some of the stuff in terms of the signal weight as like a spectrum, or like, is it slanted more towards embodied non-representational stuff versus maybe on the other side of the spectrum being representation heavy. Amanda mentioned like kind of like Maslow's pyramid of needs or self-actualization. There was sort of a cognitive aspect of that, and I actually think that's a very interesting thing to think about in terms of what Shamar was getting at in his newer work. I think that actually fits really well with the synergy stuff. And I didn't, at the time of our discussion, I hadn't really heard him talk about that part of it yet, or it wasn't as clear to me. But last night, and I still didn't finish the entire video, but hearing him talk about synergies, I think fits really well with that sort of pyramid hierarchy of cognitive stuff. And he's basically like synergies, and I don't really know how to talk about this yet, but I'm interpreting it as like, I think what he's getting at is he kind of sees it very similar to our meta brains setup. Like he kind of sees there's this underlying embodiment intelligence that's just there. Like that's sort of the base. You're never really gonna. I feel like it's a base layer, and it's never really gonna go away. It can be overruled, like absolutely overruled, especially for humans, maybe predominantly for humans in that sense. You know, to various ills and goodnesses. Well, like it's there, and it's kind of the baseline of functioning. And I believe he's kind of talking about synergies as these constructed dynamics, and he talks about them in kind of a anti-entropic kind of way, where there's this sort of, it can be dancing or a song, but like in the moment of, I really liked it. I really liked how he brought it up, and I can't recall it entirely, but he's basically talking about how like when you're doing a dance for a specific set of time, there's specific rules that you're engaged in. There's specific, you're creating this constructed environment, and it's a temporary thing, but you and the partner or whatever are, there's an engagement of it, and there's a relationship to the music, or a song is a song for a specific amount of time, and there's a tempo and a movement in the songs, in the track itself. And it's like he's talking about how, I think he's trying to work on this sort of theory of what he calls synergies. I might call them more like constructed like discrete chunks of operation that are tailored towards a specific shared cognitive parameter, or like sense of what's going on. And I feel like Amanda's comment about that fits pretty well, in the sense of like I really like how Shamara was basically talking about there's a certain requirement of investment and energy to make those things last. Literally, like if you're doing a dance, like literally you have to physically do that. There's also a mental opportunity cost to believing, all right, I am in the dance, I am doing this coordinated set of things. And I feel like I'm really curious what he's going to do in that area. And going all the way back to the dynamical system stuff, like it was cool to hear him talk a little bit how he's trying to use dynamical systems not just as a concept, but like trying to use them as a means methodologically to derive some statistical like knowledge from stuff. And I'm curious between that and also another paper the paper that Bradly mentioned that Amanda was also interested in was about like that paper from the two papers that you submitted a little bit earlier was about like Varela and someone trying to do some methodological improvement in that area comes to mind. But anyway, I'm kind of, as if we didn't cover enough topics already. I'm a little bit like scattered. So I welcome any other comments from Amanda or anybody else or Bradly. So
why don't we leave it there? And then I just wanted to mention that there's a new paper that we have out that just came out as a chapter, and this is a paper that we worked on last year, and we did this conference. It's called the BICA Conference, Biologically Inspired Cognitive Architectures Conference, and that was like last summer. And so this is myself, Daniela Cialfi, Avery, and Jesse are on this paper, and this is just a conference paper on this idea of Gibsonian information. And I think Jesse mentioned that in the chat, the thread that we just talked about. So this is it's about 6 pages, so we couldn't get into too much of the details of this, but it's a sketch of this idea. So it's this idea of direct perception shaping, the nervous system and behavior and cognition, and then we define it kind of as a form of information. So we think of information theory, and we think about Shannon information, and we think about entropy, and this is a little bit different. This operates on the principle of direct perception as being the primary form of the information. And so this is some of the math here. And, this is like just discusses how GI operates in the nervous system, which is Gibsonian information, and then discussing some future directions. So this is largely engineering and technological aspects of it. And then there's some references here. So it's a pretty short paper, but this is going to serve as sort of the seed for this idea. I'd like to get into this idea a little bit more. There's a longer preprint that we have that needs to be rewritten to sort of draw, sort of or build upon this short conference paper, and it'll give us an opportunity to sort of explore some different themes. We have, there have been some presentations on this, and the preprint we have now is actually exploring a lot more deeply and giving some practical examples. So this is a case where we have this mathematical model, some of these ideas, and then we're going to explore them further out. And so, if people want to be involved in that, let me know. I think maybe Amanda might be able to contribute some things. And, so we'll be working on this, and we have other other things as well. I think I'd like to explore this thread a bit more if we want to have a separate group, or if we want to have like a regular check-in on the topic, just so it doesn't get thrown to the wolves. A lot of ideas kind of get subsumed as we go through them, and we forget a lot about it. So I want to make sure we keep up on this.
So I want to mention one and a half things about this. Number one, at the very end of my comments, I mentioned Avery, who and allostatic kinds work, and I feel like there's a really interesting overlap between some of Avery's ideas. I wish I could just get Avery and us and Tony Chamero in just talk for an entire week in a row,
Right.
But a long time. I was gonna say an hour, 2 or 3, 4, no, days, weeks, anyway. But Avery's work there is really interesting, and I'm trying. If you may recall, I'm not gonna pull it up. I mentioned Tony. Oh, also if people have questions for Tony Chamero, he's really cool about replying to stuff on Twitter. At least I've had good success. So we could ask him a question, or maybe we could even try eventually to maybe not invite him, but humbly request that he offers us some more attention in some way. But I asked him on Twitter, oh, are you using VR in a particular way? And he's like, yeah, I've been using a whole lot of stuff in this particular way. Look at our CAP Institute. And I went to that webpage, and the webpage is down. And I emailed the director of their contact this person, and I contacted him. Oh, we're alive and well, but our website is not. And it was this funny thing, and I'm waiting to hear back more because I'm super curious to see what it is. And it's suffice to say, there will definitely be ongoing discussions. I feel due diligence to incorporate and I haven't had the conversation fully with Avery yet, but there's some major Avery stuff connections here, and there's the VR component, and I think all of those things are going to be coming together. I think it's going to be a big topic for me personally, and in the lab. And I don't know what to put it under, but there's definitely going to be stuff in that area. So if you have interest in any of that stuff, or I forget who it was. I don't know if it was Sadena or was it you, Amanda? Someone was really interested in methodological opportunities in cognitive science for some specific topics, and I feel we're going to be really coming up against that right now. And I'm actually really impressed with a lot of what Chamero's doing for not being able to see it anyway. But more about that to come. So anyway, we're super over. So
that's okay.
Move on.
Amanda asked a question to flesh out relationship between digital and symbolic. I feel like I've started to use them interchangeably, but that's probably not right. So yeah, it's not. Digital is more it may be discrete is another word for digital, and people will use those words, discrete versus continuous, digital versus analog. Those are basically the same, and
it would be really fun to compare and contrast those things maybe in the taxonomy component of the cognition future stuff, because I think about too, and digital also is sort of representational in a way, but not necessarily, because it could be about stuff that isn't present in the moment, your genomic coding is digital in a way. Well, the phenotype, the analog expression in environment it's etc. So
Yeah, I
all
was going to
interesting
get to that. So yeah, I mean, like when we have digital representations, I mean, the world is continuous. I guess you could argue. I mean, some people would argue there's also a sort of a discrete component to reality, but it's mostly continuous. And so, if you're mapping to like a digital or discrete system, and what you do oftentimes in statistics, you do it sometimes in descriptions, that requires you to abstract things from the continuous. So we had that figure that Jesse liked that I made from a couple weeks ago. I drew it out and then I gave it to him for the EI workshop. That was where we had the idea of controllability. So we had the controller and the controlled, and the controller needs to have as many states as the controlled to be like a good regulator. And so what that means, though, is that you have this representation. The controller as a representation of the controlled object, and it has to have enough states to fully represent the states in the controlled aspect, because if it can't, then it can't really give the proper signals. So I mean, I'm not going to draw it back out, but basically this idea of feedback.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to have it. There we go. All right. So this is the, yeah. So the controller is A, the controlled is B. And then, if there are more states in A than B, that's maybe good. It may not be, though. It may be that, you have a lot of redundancy in A with respect to B, which, I mean, that might be well regulated. But basically the idea here is that if A is something that's controlling B has only 3 states, and B has like 50, if B is in one state versus another, unless there's a high redundancy of those states, in other words, unless multiple states basically mean the same thing, then A can't really represent enough information to properly control B. It can only say yes, no, and maybe, say. And then B might have like 50 states where it's giving all these different things, that transitions and things. And then the controller can't really do anything. It can only say, yes, no, maybe, and that's the level of control. And that's not very good if you're talking about, good regulation. So I know some of you don't know what this is, but this is from the Evergood Regulator Theorem. So this is a paper that was written in the, it's a sort of a cybernetics paper where they talk about what does good regulation look like. And again, these are linguistic terms, good or well. And so this is an attempt to sort of put some sort of technical skin on those bones. And so, but this is an example of how you can go from, that discrete is symbolic in a lot of ways, because you're abstracting from a naturalistic context that is continuous, and you're trying to create discrete states and say this means basically this range of things in the real world. So, like a refrigerator is a description of a thing that holds food that is chilled, to a certain temperature. There are different designs you can have for a refrigerator, but they're all basically the same linguistic term. And so that's an example of like a discrete thing that's symbolic, that takes from this continuous distribution in the natural world. And so that's actually something that we mentioned in the Gibsonian information work, but it's not spelled out exactly like that. But that's So thank you, Samantha, for attending. And Erin thought it was hilarious that, oh yeah, it's in the Slack. It's if you're in the information theory channel, if you join that channel, it's in there. Erin thought it was hilarious. We are alive and well, but our website is not. The other thing about that is, okay, there we go, is that if you don't have a website, you don't exist. So,
the saying, it's not who knows you, or who you know, or who knows you, but it's like who can find you. Like you have to be found. Even if you don't really care about networking, you gotta be able to be found. And if you can't, then you're really out of luck.
Yeah. So I don't think we'll do a paper today. I think we'll leave it at that. I don't know if anyone has anything else to say. about any of the things. We've covered a lot of stuff today, so I don't want to.
Yeah, this is like a super dense meeting. So any like comments, free open comment session before the end of the day. I still feel my head in like I'm in Brian's presentation, and I'm in Sadena's stuff, and then I'm in the Shamero land. I didn't even talk about Jeremy Lynn's stuff, which is fine this other time.
Yeah, we can save it for next
New Year
week.
celebration.
Yeah, and so yeah, thank you, Brian, and we're gonna follow up on your talk next week. So please bring that. And I don't know, sometimes if you think about it over the course of the week, you reflect on it, you can get some more, deeper thoughts about it. And then, anyone who wants to present on anything, we can do that. I think it's good, even if it's something like a little infographic or a mind map, that's exactly what we want to review because it's really useful.
Really, yeah. Sorry, Bradley. What were you saying?
Oh, no, it's fine. I'm done.
I'd really encourage, like, if you have a rough mind map that doesn't look anything as nice as Sadena's, and you just want to talk about where you are and just like use a whiteboard as like literally a piece of paper and say, well, here, like, I'm kind of here looking at this, here's a question line and whatever. Like, do that. That's great. Because that's, getting it out of your digital mind into an analog reality. It makes it so everybody can see it on the medium of whatever we're doing here. Like, that's cryptic messages about do that. But, that's cool. And I think this actually, I really, really like in other labs that I've been in, I've been super uncomfortable with anything like that. And so I'm so thankful that there's spaces and people modeling do that. That's the hard work of stuff. Having your fancy papers is done is like, all right, that's nice. Well, like the nitty gritty and the ins and outs, we do it really nice here. That's why I like Johan's group too. Like he's really like open to that, and like he gets excited when people come in that don't know stuff. It's like, oh great, now I get another mind to bounce this off of and like present stuff, and like where are you on your journey of this? Like, so all that's inspiring to see. So that's cool. There's a billion other things to talk about. Please use Slack to say if you have any ideas. Were you going to say something, Brian, or anyone else who's here? Okay, cool. Yeah, it's exciting.
All right. So thank you for attending, and see you on Slack. And actually, next week I won't be able to make the meeting at our regular scheduled time. So we're going to have to...
I probably won't be either.
Yeah.
Because I'll be at... So we may not have a live meeting.
Okay. I don't know if people feel about a Sunday meeting instead of a Saturday meeting. It might be a little too intrusive. But, we can work it out. We can just maybe skip and then have updates. And then the next week we can go into what we were going to go into that week. So we'll discuss that on Slack.
I'll probably be around for some kind of an informal, it may not be a 2-hour deal, but just like, I'll be up for a Sunday check-in like myself, or even talking about the conference, what happened. I don't know if I'm able to do anything live from it, but yeah, so that's cool. That sounds good.
All right. Thank you for attending.